Good afternoon, everybody. It's top of the hour, noon Eastern time. Other folks possibly dialing in from other time zones. Welcome to our webinar this week on developing custom connectors for the Microsoft Power Platform. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your presenter for today. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and Envision IT, located in Mississauga, just outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're recording the session. We're going to make the slides available and post them up on the event deck. We'll send out an email follow-up after the webinar once those are there. So all my contact details will be available, and all the details that we're presenting through the session are up in there as well. So let me start with a quick agenda of what we want to cover off today. So we're going to start with a brief overview of Microsoft's Power Platform, Power Apps, Flow, and Power BI being those. Then we're going to dive into custom connectors specific to Power Apps and Microsoft Flow. We're going to go fairly deep on that side. It's going to get a little technical. Apologies if you're not a developer in portions of it, but I want to make sure that people have all the tools and awareness of how to create a custom connector through there. Bear with us if that seems a little too deep and technical. We're going to flip back into more end user mode after that and say, well, now that we've built this, what can we actually do with it? And we've got some cool demos for you from that point of view. Then we're going to talk more about custom connectors for Power BI. We're not going to go as deep on that side. I don't have time in the 1 hour session to go right into Visual Studio and start going through creating a custom connector for Power BI, but I will give links and details on how that process works. We have the Q&A open on the GoToWebinar throughout the entire session, so feel free to ask questions as you're going through, but other folks on the call that will do their best to answer the questions, and any remaining at the end, we'll circle back to those and answer those. So before we dive into the content, though, I wanted to get a quick sense of who's using what from the tools that we're going to be talking about here today. So Office 365 is kind of the precursor to all of this. And then within that suite, we've got Microsoft Flow, Power Apps, and Power BI. So I'll give you a minute to answer that through, and then I'll share the responses back so we can get a sense of what the audience looks like. Okay. So let me share that back. So 95% of the folks using Office 365, that's awesome. We've seen more and more penetration, and it's really becoming the de facto norm for any new engagements for us. On-premises is kind of fading back into memory, so cool, thank you. Microsoft Flow Power Apps, kind of 1/3 of the folks using each of those. Not sure if those are the same 1/3 across each, quite likely. But half the people using Power BI, so that's great to see too. It's an awesome visualization tool for the folks that don't use it today. We're going to show you a couple dashboards just to give you a sense, and hopefully that'll get some excitement going, and maybe you can start playing around on the Power BI side as well. Okay, so let me hide that. And we just go to our next slide here. So quick introduction on the Microsoft Power Platform. So as I mentioned, Power Apps, Flow, and Power BI are the 3 tools that we're going to be talking about here that all make up that Power Platform. They can be used within Office 365, within Dynamics 365. They can be standalone applications as well. And we're going to be focusing on data connectors for those 3. And Azure is going to be playing a big part of that equation as well. Microsoft Azure being the cloud underlying infrastructure that not only Office 365 and Dynamics 365 are running under, but you can create your own custom applications within that as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus on custom connectors, but actually before we get into that, let me actually flip to a couple of other screens here. So one of these is, this is an example of a Power BI dashboard. Now this is one of the sample data sets that's available from Microsoft. And the nice thing about Power BI, if you're not familiar with it and you want to just sort of kick the tires and play around with it, there's a number of different scenarios they have, this one being a sales and marketing example, that you can pull down into your tenant and start interacting with that data. So this is showing us sales and marketing data, market share, units, volumes, sentiment by month, by manufacturer, lots of different charts through here. Now the key thing with Power BI though is not just a static report, it's very interactive. So as I start to click and interact with things in here, if I click on productivity, I can go into a drill down on that particular section. I can even do what's called Q&A, start asking questions about my data and interacting with it from there. I can also have interactions within the elements on the dashboard as well if I want to get deeper from that point of view. So very interactive, very great way to visualize large sets of data and start to bring some meaning into it from that point of view. And the sources for this, as we'll talk about in a second, can be very varied and include not just Microsoft, but a broader ecosystem as well. So that's one of the Power App side of things. The second one is Microsoft Flow. So this is all about building workflows. You've got processes you want to connect up together. You want to wire that up. Actually, let me show you a slightly different one here. I'll flip to a different window. This is actually one that I used last week in my webinar I was giving on integration between Valo Teamwork and our Extranet User Manager product. And this was a workflow that I created on top of the Teamwork product. Basically, it says when somebody requests a new team through Valo Teamwork, this trigger occurs that says, okay, somebody just placed an order against that Teamwork orders list in SharePoint. And we can look at that order and say, well, if its status is equal to ordered, which means it's initially ordered but nothing's happened with it yet, then let's go through some steps from that. And the first step we need to do is to say, okay, well, if it is an order, we want to actually start an approval process against that, because we don't want to necessarily just go ahead and create that, but we want some logic around that. So send somebody an email, maybe that's a group, maybe that's dependent on who requested the order, and then look at the conditions that come back from that approval. If it is approved, set the approval status, send a follow-up email, and then further actions happen from there. So this is sort of a simple example. We've got a bit of an approval, a bit of a condition statement in there, but you can build some fairly complex workflows as part of that. So that's two of the three. The third is on the Power Apps side. So we have the ability to create applications within Power Apps. They could be connected with Office 365, or they could live as their own application. So let's actually come over to our site provisioning example. So here we've got a site in our SharePoint Online Office 365 tenant where we track all of the various different sites that exist within our environment. And let me just come back to the home on that. And I have a link here to request a new site. So let's say I want a new Office 365 group or a SharePoint team site. I click on this link here. I'm actually going to Power Apps. And what we've done is we've just customized the out-of-the-box SharePoint list form and replaced it with a Power Apps form, because the underlying list has a whole bunch of columns on there that we don't want people to be filling out. We just want to capture these couple of key pieces of information. What's the site name that you want to create? What template do you want to use? And depending on what I answer here, if I say, well, I want a modern client site, we actually open up some other fields. We've got some business rules there that say, if I've chosen this, then make this happen, fill out the remaining information there, save that, and that simply saves back to that SharePoint list. And then we again have a SharePoint or a Flow workflow underneath that triggers off and goes through that approval and site creation process. So those are some simple examples, but gives you a sense of what the three Power applications look like. Now, several of those examples, we've actually used custom connectors already, and we're going to circle back to them later in the talk and kind of review what that looks like. So the idea behind custom connectors, the extending the data reach, is to say, well, Flow or Power Apps or Power BI may not be aware of your particular application or your particular service that you're using. You can create a custom connector for that and extend the reach of that. And the nice thing here is that, as I mentioned, we're going to get pretty technical. That technical act of creating the custom connector can be done, by your internal IT team, or you could outsource to an organization like Envision IT or Extranet User Manager to build that for you. Once you've got it built, you can actually have a power user start to engage with that and build those workflows. You don't need a developer to do the whole solution end to end. It's really just this connector piece that's the technical piece to it. So the connector itself is a wrapper around an API, an application programming interface that allows the underlying service to talk to Microsoft Flow and Power Apps. And actually the other way around as well. Flow and Power Apps can talk to that service. So it goes both directions. If we look at what comes out of the box with Power Apps and Flow today, it's actually really impressive. I mean, Microsoft has provided a wealth of out-of-the-box connectors. Third-party ISVs have provided. I mean, we're using GoToWebinar for this session right now, which used to be owned by Citrix. That got spun off to LogMeIn. It's not a Microsoft service, but you can see that we've got GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar as connector options in there. We've got Salesforce, we've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, Box, Dropbox, all sorts of vendors, not just Microsoft focused, have connectivity into this this environment. So it becomes very powerful. You could say, if I see a particular tweet that tags our organization. Maybe I want to send an email to public affairs to have a look at that. Should they retweet it? Do we want to keep a record of that in a SharePoint list? You can start to build some very interactive flows from that point of view. So this list of 200 plus connectors, that was back in September of last year when this was first presented at Microsoft Ignite. I'm not sure what the current number is today, but it's continuing to grow all the time. So that connectivity can happen also not just to cloud services, but to on-premise systems as well. So there's what's called an on-premises data gateway. It's another product from Microsoft that works with the Power Platform, and it allows Power Apps, Flow, and Power BI, all three of those things, to reach into your on-premises data, respecting whatever security you've put in place as part of that, and interact with those systems as well. So you provide the security credentials, you manage the authentication from that point of view. So you can really extend the reach for your organization with these custom connectors, not just across these 200 plus, but to any of the systems that you've built organizationally yourselves, or maybe ones that aren't on this list, but you still want to interact with. So why would you want to build a connector? What are the scenarios around that? Well, the first scenario is that you're an enterprise developer. You work for a mid-sized, large organization. You've got line of business systems, and rather than building custom code for everything that you're doing with those systems, can you start to leverage things like Flow and Power Apps to build more agile, more easily managed and created applications against those systems? So, that service may not be one that they support, so you need to provide that connectivity to that customer, to that internal service. The other example that we actually fit into is as a partner in an independent software vendor. So we're an ISV. We have a product called Extranet User Manager, and it has some very obvious connections for Flow and Power Apps. And we're actually going to talk about some of those scenarios as well. Now, we haven't gone through the certification process yet. We're going to talk about that at the end of the session. You can actually certify your connectors if it's a public connector. Let's say you're a software as a service company, and you want your customers to be able to use Flow and Power Apps and Power BI with your application. You can actually publish that as a public connector. It goes through a testing and certification process and then becomes available for anybody to use. All right, so let's dive a little deeper into the underlying architecture of connectors. So starting on the left, we've got Flow and Power Apps out of the box from Microsoft, and we've got some RESTful API on either our system or on an external vendor's system. The two don't know about each other, so we need to define something to connect those together. So we've got the API gateway. So this is provided by Microsoft, and it's basically the place that you define and upload your custom connectors. Now, part of the challenge with custom connectors is Flow and Power Apps don't necessarily understand all the authentication that needs to happen against that RESTful API on the other side, because it may be completely different authentication. Flow and Power Apps are built on top of Office 365. They use Azure AD as the underlying authentication scheme, but we have in the API gateway a token store that allows us to keep credentials. So as a connection comes through from Flow or Power Apps, that's authenticated with Azure AD. You get to decide who gets to use that custom connector, and that connection ID reaches into the token store and gets back the credentials for the RESTful API. So there's a mapping that happens between the identity that's coming in from Flow and Power Apps and the identity that's coming across over to that RESTful API. So there's some more options to that as well. You may have a custom web API. You may have Azure Functions, Azure Automation, different examples of things that you can build on the right-hand side. You can connect those up with that same custom connector environment. As I mentioned, you can also go to on-premises. So on the right there, we see the on-premises data gateway. That becomes the broker between the RESTful API and the API gateway that's out in the Microsoft cloud. So a lot of people worry, okay, if I want my on-premises infrastructure to be connected to the cloud, I need to publish that content up into the cloud, and there's all sorts of security concerns about that. How do we do that appropriately? And that's really what the on-premises data gateway is all about. Think of it as a a reverse proxy. Basically, it's publishing an endpoint that the custom connectors can talk to, but it's installed on the on-premises infrastructure. Now, you don't need to open any firewall ports or do anything from a network security perspective from that point of view, because what it does is it just needs outbound access. It connects up to the cloud and says, hey, I'm here, and I'm going to pull you every now and then to look for new things. Let me know what's happening through there. So it actually makes it much cleaner from a network security point of view in terms of how that gets published out. Okay, so that's the underlying architecture from a high-level solution architecture perspective. Let's actually go through what's involved in developing your custom connector, which is our prime focus for the talk here today. So the first thing is, that right-hand side, the API, the RESTful API, the Azure Functions, automation, whatever it is you want to be talking to, you need to understand how that works. That you need to know what is the interface, what are the methods that I have, what things can I do with that. And then there's a number of ways that you can provide the definition of that API back to your custom connectors. You can start from scratch and build it all out. I don't actually recommend that you do that. If you've got an open API definition or a Postman collection, we're going to talk more about what Postman is in a minute, then strongly encourage you to use those. Now, the next piece is a critical one, is how is the authentication going to happen? How do I make sure that this is secure? You do have the option of hidden anonymous endpoints, and for certain scenarios that could make sense. Let's say you've got a postal code to address lookup publicly available that you'll want to be able to just hit and provide a connector to. You could certainly do that. Basic authentication, which is username and password, strongly discourage that because the credentials are actually going through in clear text. It's not a secure way of doing authentication. But unfortunately, some APIs are built using basic authentication. You can't change the API, so you got to live with the security implications of that. I mean, if you do it over HTTPS, so it's all secure from an encryption point of view, it's safer. It's still not best practice, but it's better. Preferred would be to use an API key, which is an example we're going to be using here. OAuth. So if you want to pass across the Azure AD credentials that came in from the inbound to the API on the other side, you can certainly do that. Or if you're on premises, you can secure it with Active Directory from a Windows authentication point of view. Then you need to define the operations for your connector. The definition that you brought in may be much broader than what you're looking to do. Maybe there's only a couple of functions in that API that you actually want to leverage in the custom connector. You can trim that down. You need to define what the request and response payloads look like for that. And we're going to actually take you through a step-by-step example of doing that and building that out. Once you've done that, save it, test it, and try it out in Flow and Power Apps. Rinse and repeat from there. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a step-by-step of actually creating a custom connector. And the example that I'm using here, this actually came from a talk at Ignite, and the Yelp example was a great one. So if you're not familiar with Yelp, Yelp is a business review engine. So if you're looking for a great restaurant in your area, Yelp is what a lot of people turn to find that for them. Basically, what we're going to do is use the Yelp Fusion API and build a custom connector around that. Now, I've published up the step-by-steps that we're going to follow through this, and as much as I can, I'm going to have it side-by-side screen shared so we can go through that together. Now, you can certainly follow those steps yourself after the fact, and I encourage you to do that if you want to try out building a custom connector. This is a great way to go through that example. So let's get a couple windows open here, and we'll go from there. So first off, we want to start with the Yelp My Fusion app, and I'm going to get one other window open here. And we'll just put those beside each other. So this is the article that I was referring to that basically takes you through the step-by-step process that we're going to be following as we go through. And the first step is just to understand the documentation around the APIs themselves. As I mentioned, understanding that API is the first step to building your custom connector. Now for Yelp, their services are not anonymously publicly available. You have to create a developer account. It doesn't cost anything, but you need to register your email, create a password, log into the site, and build and create an app within their site. Now, I've already gone through those first steps here, and I didn't want to delete my app and start over in the demo. I'll just share this with you. This app doesn't actually do anything secure, so I'm not too worried about the API key here. I recreate it periodically as I'm doing these demos as well. But basically, the steps on the right take you through the process of how you create that app, and eventually at the end of that, you'll get a client ID and an API key, which are these elements that we have here on the My App that we've got. So the next step is to actually start playing around with these apps. And I mentioned Postman. So Postman is an open source product, which is a great way to try out and experiment with REST APIs. So let me actually just pull that up here. So I have a workspace, just like Yelp, best to actually create an account in Postman. And what it'll do is it'll hang on to the various different experimenting that you're doing, which makes it great to be able to come back later and play with that. So Yelp actually publishes a Postman collection. So you can come up to the new here, pull in a collection right from Yelp, and that basically explains the different methods that they have available in their API. Let me just walk you through what those different methods are. So the first one really for most people is the businesses search. And basically it's a way for you to look for businesses by name, by category, keywords, by location. There's a number of different parameters as part of that. Once you've got an individual business, that brings back an ID for that business. You can get additional details on that business with this call here. You can get the specific reviews for that business through this call. If you know the phone number of a business, you could do a search by phone number. You can also search for transactions. The autocomplete is a neat one if you're building a web form and you want people to be able to start typing in the name of a business and have it autocomplete the full name of the business for you. That's what that endpoint is for. We're actually going to focus on the business's search and the business's ID reviews, those two there. So I've actually got one up here right now. So I've done a search and I've put in the term delis and I've put in the location Toronto, and I go ahead and hit send on here, and it's actually live querying out to Yelp, and it's bringing back the results from that API. Now this looks a little unfriendly to a non-developer. This is called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And it's basically the data that comes back. So I can see in here, the first result is called Panzer's Original Deli. That's the top result coming back, and it's giving me the details around it. The URL to the site, the image URL of the picture for it, what's its rating, what its latitude and longitude, what sort of transactions does it have, all sorts of details around that. And it just keeps going. Exits Avenue Open Kitchen, and I've got more and more results coming back through there. Now, what I didn't show you when I first came in here, before I started this, is I actually need to set up my authorization in Postman against Yelp. So if you remember, if I'm back on my Yelp page, I've got this client ID and API key. I need to pass this API key through to everything that I'm doing. That's what authorizes those calls. So I have to tell Yelp from Postman, hey, I want to do authorization and I want to pass, it's called a bearer token. So you have to actually put the word bearer and that token that comes back from Yelp in the header that gets submitted. Otherwise, I'm going to get an access denied and Yelp's not going to tell me anything from that. Okay, so I could go deeper. I could say, well, let's take that first deli there. Let's grab his ID. Let's go to the business's ID. And paste that in. Actually, I haven't tried this. Let's see if I get the format right. Nope, I didn't get the bearer matching. Oh, right, I didn't paste that in. You know what, let's leave that for now. We've got the one call working. I'm not going to debug things as we go live through here. Okay, so let's have a look back at our steps. So we've played around, we understand the API, we're getting results back through Postman. That's all great. What I can do from there is I can actually right click on this in here, and I can export that collection back out. So if I've done some tweaking to it to make it exactly the way that I want it, I can actually share that out, and that's what's going to be the input into my custom connector in Flow and Power Apps. Now it looks a little scary. I have to choose this first option of deprecated because collection v1 is the format that Flow and Power Apps want for that. They haven't updated from that point of view yet. Okay, so let's come back to my steps. So we've gone through all these ones here. We're now at the point that we want to create the Yelp custom connector. So we're going to do this over in Flow. So let's get my other window open and come back to my Flow window here. And up in my gear, I have this option for custom connectors. Now I've got this already set up from a dry run point of view, but we're actually going to go through the process of creating a net new custom connector. So I've got a couple of options. I can create it from blank if I want to be brave and set that all up. I can use an open API definition, but we're going to import a Postman collection. So I need to give this a name. I'll call it live demo. Say import here, and I've got my saved collection that I previously exported this morning. Go ahead and hit continue. Okay, so I'm now into a step-by-step of building out that custom connector. So let's catch up from this point of view. So the next thing I need to do is set up my security. So I need to tell Flow that API key as well. So I'm going to change this from OAuth to API key. There's a couple of parameters I need to copy in here. I'm good there. I don't actually need the key yet. We're going to come back to that in a second when we actually set up the connection credentials. So we'll go on to the definition. So it already knows all those methods that we set up in our Postman collection. But actually, as I mentioned, we only want to focus on two of those. We're just going to focus on the business reviews and the business search to keep it simple. So you can't see it all as I've got the screen smaller here, but the transaction search, I'll click and delete. This one here is a search by phone. I don't need that. Businesses ID reviews. So that one I do want. That gives me the reviews coming back. Businesses by ID. I said, no, we don't want that. We don't need the autocomplete. And we do want the businesses search. So we've got those two that we want to define as part of that. Now we need to give it a little more detail for each of those. So let's start with the businesses ID reviews. We come down here. What we need to do first is give it a proper meaningful name that we want to have it show up with in Flow. So I'm going to copy that business reviews in here. Now this one, the operation ID, we have to be careful. We've got an exclamation because we put a space in there. Let's just take the space out and we're good there. We come down to the request. Now we need some sample. So we can use some sample IDs here. So let's just do an import from sample. We're going to do a get. And we'll grab this URL. So that came from the Yelp documentation. I'll paste that sample URL in, and it's basically going to hit that endpoint and get back the details of what it needs. So it knows that the parameter it needs is ID of the business coming back as part of that. Now it also needs to understand what's going to come back as a response for that. So we've got a default response in here, but it doesn't have anything set up in there just yet. So let's go ahead and import that from a sample. So if I come over to my business reviews Yelp documentation page, they're nice. They actually give me a sample response body. I could have taken this out of my Postman, but we'll actually just grab it right from the page in here. So I copy that. Don't try and, oh no, they fixed it. You couldn't edit in this before. You could just paste, but now I can paste in there, which is good. Okay, so I paste all that JSON in. It will tell me if there's an error in that JSON. It all looks good. So it now understands all the various different pieces that are going to come back from that response. So my validation is good. We're all good on that side. We just need to do the same thing with the businesses search. So let's come down to my steps here. We're going to set the summary, the description, and the operation ID. We've got no space there, so that's good. So we don't need to import a sample request. We don't have any parameters for this, so that's fine, but I do need the response body. So let's go back to our Yelp page. Here's our businesses search. Now, the thing to be aware of is they gave you sort of a sample example here, and they actually put a ... saying, you could have more businesses in here. That's actually not valid JSON, so it's going to blow up when we paste it in. So let's actually first copy that. We'll come back to our flow. We'll say we want to import from a sample. Oh wait, no, that's the request. I don't need that. It's the response. And when I first try and paste that in, it's going to say that's not valid JSON. So we just need to be careful. Come in and take out that comma and the ... Now it's good. And I can import it. You can see there's actually a lot of data that comes back from that business's response. Okay, so we've got our two API definitions set up in there. I can come through into the test. Now, first thing I need to save it, so just hit the checkbox here. And we're now ready to test it out. Now, before we can test it, remember we had the authentication credentials we need to worry about. We need to actually create a new connection. This is where we're going to use the API key and provide those connections. So let's say we want to bring in a new connection. I need the API key, so let's go back to Yelp. Let's grab that whole key. Now you won't see it on the screen here, but you have to be careful because you actually need to type the word bearer with a space and then paste that key in, just like we did on the Postman for that to work properly. I go ahead and create the connection. So that's good. I can come back here. I need to hit the little refresh button so it sees that new connection that I just created. And we can go ahead and test the operation. So let's go ahead and do the test. Drum roll, please. Hey, we get Panzers as the deli back again. And we can play around with that. We say, well, I'm not looking for a deli. I want to go upscale a bit. Let's go for a steakhouse. And we get some different results coming back here. Jacobs & Co. coming up at the top. Our office is actually in Mississauga, not in Toronto. So let's modify that, test that out. Blackstone Steakhouse and Grill. Apparently that's the place to go around our office. Cool. I haven't been there myself. I'll have to try it out sometime. Okay, so we now have our custom connector built. So let's actually start using that in a flow. Now this is going to be kind of an odd flow. There's not that much that we're going to be doing with it, but it kind of gives you the example of how you work with that custom connector. So let's come over to our My Flows, and we'll say we want to create a new flow from blank. There's lots of templates you can use, but we're going to just use a blank one. And we're not actually going to have a source system that's triggering this. So we can use what's called a manual trigger. So we can fire it off ourselves. We'll just use this flow button for mobile. Now we need some inputs into the system. So we can add a text input in here to say, hey, I want to know the term that we're searching for. And I also want to know the location because we're going to pass those as parameters to our API. So let's set up the next step from there. So we see we've got our custom tab here. Oh, wait a minute, why don't I see my new connector? That's weird. Let me just check something quick here. I've got my live demo there. I might have to use the old connector. Something weird's going on that it's not showing up there. Let's use the driver that I used earlier. That should be fine. So there's two actions within that because we have the businesses and the business reviews. Well, we want the businesses. We want to actually search for businesses as part of this. So it's got the term and the location. It's got hard-coded text in there. I don't actually want to provide that. What I want to do is I want to wire it up to the term that came as the input on there. Sorry, let me make the screen a little bigger. It's getting a little awkward there. Okay, and here we want to wire this up to the dynamic content of the location that came from that manual input. Let's make sure that matches. Term and location, yeah. Okay. So we can go ahead and save that. And let's just do a test against this. Like I said, we're not doing anything too sophisticated here. I'll go ahead and perform the trigger action. So what it's going to do is prompt me for those inputs. So yeah, let's continue. So we've got my two text boxes that I added there. So the term is, let's look for a vegan restaurant. Let's mix it up. And let's still look in Mississauga. Go ahead and run that flow. So I can see the flow activity. Didn't take very long to run. So the nice thing with flow is it actually shows you, think about the example I showed you before with the approval steps and such. It'll actually show you the path that flow takes through there. So I can open this up to say, okay, those inputs were input in, and this is what came back. So Raw Aura in Mississauga is the top vegan restaurant in the Mississauga area. So, I mean, like I said, this doesn't really show you a business example, but it gives you a sense of how you create a flow and wire it up to the custom connectors. I'll show you some better business examples as we get later on in the session. Cool. So we now have our custom connector defined. We've built a flow to use it. Next step that we want to go through here is to actually build a Power App as part of that. So let's go back to our directions that we've got here. We can skip through the flow. We've done all that. We'll come down to the Power Apps. The first thing I want to do is go to Power Apps itself. And I want to actually build a new blank Canvas app. Let's make it a phone app. We want to be mobile friendly. Go ahead and create that. Takes a second, then we get our canvas open. There we go from there. So first thing we want to do is put in what's called a vertical gallery, something to show the results of the businesses from there. So if I come over to here, again, I think I'm going to need to make my screen a little bigger for a moment here. So we come over to Insert, and we want Gallery and our vertical gallery. We're going to move down the page a little bit. So we want to make some space at the top because we're going to insert a couple of controls. So let's put a label in there. We'll call that term. So we'll set the text on it. I'll be lazy and just copy it, drop another one underneath, line them up, and we'll call this one location. Okay, now we want to actually put in a text input box. Let's make that a little smaller, bring it up, and we want to give a name to that box. Call it search term. We'll take that guy, create one more box, and we'll call it search location. Okay, so we've got all the visual elements on our form, but nothing's actually connected up to a connector just yet. So let's actually go through that process. So I come back to my steps. We've got the gallery, we've got the labels in there. Now what we want to do is come to view data sources and add in our new data source. So let's come to our view here, data sources. We want to add a new data source, and we're going to search for Yelp. And do we feel lucky? Yeah, let's use the webinar live demo. That's the connector that we didn't see when we were in Flow. Okay, so we now have our data source in there, and we want to actually connect them up. So if I click on the gallery here, instead of providing sample data, what I want to do is actually grab the data from in here. Now, I actually need to update my post because I've got a mistake in there. We actually want .businesses. Is that right? Sorry, I got way too many windows going here. Bear with me 1 minute. I just need to find the right for that one. I'd actually started updating my post and then I forgot to finish it before I started the webinar. Bad me. So let me get there quickly. Come into our marketing website. So we actually use Office 365 to manage the content authoring of our public website that's in Azure. We gave another talk about our Extranet User Manager Publisher back in the fall on that product. So I want to come to my articles. This one here. I got the flow, the Power Apps. There we go. That's actually what I want. Apologies on the side tour there. Okay. So we've now wired that up. Let's get our directions back up as well. So if we put some actual things in here that will give us reasonable results back, so let's put back in our vegan term and put Mississauga back in here. So we're actually starting to get some results coming back. We can actually see the raw ore coming back that we saw in our results. Now those aren't very nice looking results, so let's actually wire those up properly and get those connected in. So our title, we don't actually want the alias in there, we want the name of the restaurant. So let's just update that. That looks better. The subtitle, having the ID in there doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So let's make that we could do rating or we could do price. Let's mix it up. Let's do price. Is it a $1, $2, $3 signs through there? And we don't have any pictures in there. So let's actually get a nice image coming through. So we can actually take the image URL that comes back from Yelp, drop that in. Hey, now we're starting to get pictures of the restaurants. So cool. We actually have a working Power Apps coming through as part of that. Let's do a quick save on that. We'll save it up to Power Apps. Yes, go. Cool. So I can hit the play button now and actually have my running. So let's switch that back to our stake option. And you can see live as I'm typing there, it's actually pulling up the results and modifying from there. I can scroll through and see all the steakhouses are coming back, how many dollar signs they have on them. Now, we don't have time today, but the idea is that when you click on this arrow to view the item details, we would want to call that other API endpoint to give us all the reviews to say, well, how is the keg in Mississauga? Is it good? Has it got good reviews? Let's have a look at that. You can see how you can start to build a mobile-friendly, very powerful business application very quickly through here. So once you've got that custom connector defined, starting to build out the more complex business application and user interface side of it is actually quite straightforward. And that's the whole idea of the Power family, is that yes, the custom connectors probably need to be built by a developer. Once that infrastructure is there, a power user, a business user themselves can start to build applications and workflows and things like this themselves without requiring a developer to do that work. We're seeing it in a mobile emulator on the desktop here, but I can actually pull up my phone, go to Power Apps, pull up this app, and I now have that app functionality coming through as part of that. So it's very cool from that point of view. Okay, let's come back to our deck. So we've gone through the custom connector demo. We created the Yelp login, the Yelp app. We played around with Postman. We first started in Flow to define the custom connector. Then we built a flow using that custom connector. And the nice thing with Flow and Power Apps is they're very connected, pardon the pun, with each other. So once I've created that custom connector in Flow, it's already available in Power Apps. So I was able to build the Yelp Power Apps app through that. We've got all the step-by-steps there. I promise I will publish the update I made for that one typo in there so you don't get into the same issue that I had from that point of view. Okay, so that's our demo of creating the custom connector. Some other things to think about in terms of finishing up the connector. I skipped a bunch of steps that you should probably do as you're building this. You should build proper descriptions, you build properly friendly names in there. Maybe there's more operations that you need to define. We only did 2 for the Yelp example. So let's flesh that out, make sure it's well documented and well understandable by anybody from that point of view. Dynamic values and dynamic schema are for the user experience as the designer. And we didn't talk about triggers. We're going to come to that in a minute. Can we cause an action to happen? Let's start a flow workflow based on something that's happening in our other system. That's what a trigger is. So let's go through some more of those scenarios as we go through here. So the example I want to take next is our site provisioning example. So this was the one I touched on at the beginning. We had our request form that we built in Power Apps. That didn't use a custom connector. It was just connecting up to SharePoint, submitting an item to the list. When that item got submitted to the list, a workflow triggers off to provision those sites. So we're actually using a custom connector to do that. So let's actually come back to our browser here. And let's have a look at our flows. So this is our test one. Let's go back to my flows. And what I want is this, when an item is created, create the site flow. So let's go ahead and edit that particular flow. So this one's a very simple one. We didn't actually put any approvals on it. In our organization, we're only 15 people. We don't really need approvals for new site requests. You may, in your organization, you would just add a new step in here to add that approval step in. So when an item gets created in that list for a new site, call out to this create site function. And this green icon that we're seeing here is the default one for a custom connector. Now you can actually load your own icon in. For some of the previous demos I did on Yelp, I actually loaded the Yelp icon, so you actually see that in there. This create site custom connector takes one parameter, which is the list ID of the new site request that came through. So that's part of the requirements of the system. Once it's gone and done that, what it's doing is it's actually calling out to an Azure function, which does all the heavy lifting. There's some PowerShell in there. It creates the site. It may have connections into Extranet User Manager, other things as part of that. Once it's done all that work, send me an email, send an email to the requester, and you're done from there. So you can see, we've got a fairly technical piece of work here in the create site, but we can wrap some very easy to understand and easy to modify business logic around that with Flow. So I've created an article that goes through that whole process of how you create your Azure function and what that looks like. I encourage you to have a look at that and check that out if you'd like to. Now, the second example was around HTTP triggers. So I mentioned here, you've got the example where you want something that's happening in your system to cause a trigger in Flow. So the example we have here, we haven't built this yet, we're still in flight on it, is for Futurepreneur Canada. So they're an organization that provide business coaching, mentorship, and financing to young entrepreneurs across Canada. First step that any of those entrepreneurs need to do is to register with Futurepreneur and create an account before they do things like writing their business plan or starting to put together an application for funding as part of that. Now, Futurepreneur, as we're building this registration form, asked us, could we have a personalized letter that goes out to that young entrepreneur that's based on the location that person is registering from? So on the form, on the registration form on the left, you can see we've got a country drop down. Typically, these would all be Canadians. They do get people registering from outside of Canada, though they can't provide financing to those folks. But we also ask for the postal code. So we can track that right down to a fairly geographic area and match that to a business development manager within Futurepreneur Canada. And the idea is that Futurepreneur could keep a lookup list of postal codes that are managed by who, and in this registration process, we could look up in that, tailor an email out to that entrepreneur saying, hey, my name is Peter Carson, I'm your mentor or your business development manager, your account manager, and welcome to the whole process of working with Futurepreneur. Now we can custom build that with code, but we thought, what about doing it through Microsoft Flow? So part of our plans with our Extranet User Manager product is to actually create triggers in our custom connector so that when things happen, like I've just registered on the website, that can actually be an input to the flow. The flow could go through all those steps of figuring out who that manager is, notifying them that somebody just registered, crafting that customized email to them, sending that out to them, and doing other actions from there. Now, we already have a custom connector built for Extranet User Manager that allows you to update things in it. So we could then update the status of that user that just got approved or registered, add them to a particular group that's maybe particular to that internal business development manager, lots of things that you can create from that point of view. And the key is once you've built these webhooks and the custom connector side of it, it's really opens up all the possibilities of what you can do from that point of view. So if I come over to, let's see here. Here, I've got a couple of custom connectors. I've got the create sites that I was showing you previously. This is our Extranet User Manager custom connector. And it's got a whole bunch of methods available to it. So if we come into the definition on it, we can see here we've got a long list of definitions. So I've got things like I want to create a net new user, put them into a group, create a net new group, all those sorts of things I can do through these various actions that we've got through here. So the user's post allows me to create a new user. Sorry, it's a fairly long list. The user's put by ID allows me to update a specific user. I can create a new group, I can put specific users into specific groups. So the entire functionality of our product we've exposed as a REST application, which means we can build a custom connector around that whole application. So once you have this, again, you can start to build fairly complex business logic and flows without requiring a developer to do all that work. And that's really the key of what we're talking about here. So things like that Futurepreneur example suddenly become possible without a lot of custom development once you've got the base pieces in place. So as I mentioned, we're going to also talk about Power BI. We're not going to go as deep on that side because we're already getting close to the top of the next hour, but I do want to touch a bit on Power BI custom connectors as well. Now they're a little bit different. When you create a custom connector in Flow and Power Apps, that doesn't automatically become a custom connector in Power BI. It has its own way of creating custom connectors. I've got a slide at the end that talked about next steps. Microsoft does have some plans to bring those together to say, hey, if you build it for one, it works for all three. They're just not there yet. But just like Power Apps and Flow, there's a very wide set of out-of-the-box, not just Microsoft, but third-party software vendors connectors for Power BI, which is awesome. You know, I'm playing around with QuickBooks right now, getting our financial reporting coming up in Power BI. It's awesome. Once you get the data there, the things that you can do with it, the dashboards that you can create really give you a lot more visibility of what's happening with your organization. So with custom connectors, you can add new data sources that aren't defined there to Power BI. You know, I can connect to a REST API and make that very friendly from an analyst point of view, so they don't need to understand the underlying technology. Things like authentication become part of that as well. We can have our own custom authentication flows and really connect it in with other apps and content packs from that point of view. Direct query is a way to rather than import the data into Power BI, actually have live connections. So as people are interacting with the data, they're actually live going against those back-end data sources. Impress your friends? Well, it depends who your friends are. Power BI is actually pretty impressive though. When you bring up those dashboards and show those visualizations, it tends to be a big aha moment for a lot of senior leadership. So how does this all work? You know, we've got our data up in the cloud there. We've got Power BI. We need to use Visual Studio as part of that as well. And we create a custom connector pack in Visual Studio for that. That then becomes available in the Get Data interface in Power BI, and then I can make that part of my dashboards. So the steps is that I actually need to install a Power Query SDK into Visual Studio, develop the connector in there. I use Power BI Desktop to test that out. That's sort of the dashboard development tool. I can use the on-premises data gateway to test refresh with that, and then I can publish that up into the cloud and share that with my users from there. You know, these are some links of the landing page of Power Query, the data connectors GitHub to get the code for this, the extensions that you need for Visual Studio. So again, I'm not going to go into the details on actually building this. I just wanted to give you a sense of what are the technology pieces involved and what's needed to pull that together. So today you need to do it in Visual Studio. It's very targeted to connectors for Power BI. It does support direct query, and there is a certification program if you want to get your connector certified as a software vendor. In the future, they want to go a little further in terms of providing things like Office Store integration, having that interoperability, as I mentioned, between Flow and Power Apps, some of the other things from that point of view. So how do you move from custom connector to a full certified connector? What does that process look like? You know, the first thing is obviously you need to build your custom connectors. You got to develop it, test it, you know, share it with other people in your organization, make sure it functions appropriately and does what you need to do from that point of view. Then if you want to eliminate the custom piece from that and say, okay, we want this to be an out-of-the-box connector, it's about going through that certification process. Now, this isn't something you would do for your enterprise connector. So if you've got, you know, line of business data that you're building a custom connector for, you would never certify that because this is intended for public connectors only. So it's really, as an independent software vendor, this is where this would apply. So things like our connector for Extranet User Manager that I was showing you before, that's an example that we'd want to go through that certification process. And that is part of our roadmap plan to do that. So that certification, it's built by you, but it's certified and it's deployed by Microsoft. So what that means is that people can get it from the Microsoft store, not directly through you. They can actually get it directly from Microsoft. So it provides good exposure from your product point of view. It's a single connector, and it gives people comfort that, hey, this isn't just something from Extranet User Manager. This is actually something certified by Microsoft. So I've got a bunch of links here. I'm actually going to add a few more links through as we go through here. I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I wasn't sure exactly how the timing was going to work out from that point of view. Just want to make you aware of upcoming events. If you're going to be down at SharePoint Conference North America in May, we're actually going to have a booth down there. So come by, visit. Either myself or Logan will be thrilled to talk with you and chat from that point of view. And then I haven't been watching the questions as we've been going through. Amanda or Andrew, do we have open questions maybe we should address right now, or we'll take those as follow-ups? Not getting a response. Oh, Amanda, there we go.
Sorry, we've addressed all the questions for now.
All right, awesome. Well, listen, I'll give you 5 minutes back from your hour. I want to thank everybody for taking the time attending today. And as I mentioned, we're recording the session, so we'll publish the recording. We'll send you an email as a follow-up. I'll also post the presentation, and we'll update that one article to make sure that that's easy to follow from that point of view. So thanks very much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.